Over to you, John.
Okay. Is there a presentation up there?
Just pulling it up right now.
Okay. There we go. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this evening's virtual town hall on the topic of a ward boundary review that is underway in the city of Guelph. The purpose of this really is to orient people. So what is a ward boundary review, and how can I help as a citizen? So that's what tonight is really all about. And before we get into any kind of presentation, I just want to orient people to the technology that's going on here. First of all, I'm actually joining you. I'm talking through WebEx is the tool, and a number of you are also logged in through WebEx. But some of you are following along on facebook.com/City of Guelph. You're tracking the city's own Facebook page, and that has lots of capacity to log your comments there. So just to break the ice a little bit and to make sure you know where things are, it would be really good if you could, whether you're in WebEx or on Facebook, is to just type into the chat function, find that chat function, and in that chat, just type which ward you live in, if you know. And if you don't know, say, I don't know, okay? So just go in there and type that. And this is also being streamed live on the guelph.ca website. There's a live channel there. And some of you are even invited to phone in. There's a phone number here for those of you who don't really have web accessibility here. But if you're listening to me, you probably already know that. It's 1-408-418-9388 with an access code 129-856-0357. Okay. Most importantly, though, is to make sure that by the end of this evening, you're going to a website called haveyoursay.guelph.ca/council-composition. It's up and it's open and waiting for your comments and your questions until January 22nd. The entire consultation ends up funneling through that site. So it's very important that you register that. We'll be repeating this throughout the presentations and conversations that are going on tonight. The purpose of the consultation itself, next slide, is really tonight is more about educational. We want to inform as many people as possible that this consultation is going on and how to get involved, all right? And your wisdom and insight then feeds into, is read, is discussed by a consulting team so that they can make clear recommendations to council, because council needs to make a decision on this. So there's going to be 3 phases of consultation, and this is just one of them. But it's here to make sure, we're here to make sure that you can participate. I'm going to answer all your questions, all right? The agenda for tonight is pretty straightforward, maybe even predictable. We're getting started. That's what we're doing right now. We're going to take a little bit of time for an official welcome. And then there'll be a presentation. It'll take a little bit of time, but you're going to want to follow along carefully. And as you're listening to the presentation, you can just pop questions into the chat or comments into the chat, either on Facebook or WebEx. And we'll be gathering those throughout the evening. You don't have to wait until the conversation time. Just put them in there as soon as they pop into your head, okay? Now, the big questions, the presentation really is about the guiding principles behind this project and what the project is. And the big questions that you're going to be asked or have to do with the strengths and weaknesses of the current wards and ward boundaries, and how you would rank a certain set of guiding principles for the design of all of these ward boundaries, and why would you rank them that way. We'll be coming back to that in the survey and in this conversation here. But once we're through the presentation, then we will dive into all the questions and comments that you've been posting online and we've been harvesting throughout, and we'll then show you the next steps. And it'll be repetition. We're going to tell you to go back to that haveyoursay.guelph.ca website. Okay. The evening, the structure is, as I just mentioned, there's a presentation, there's add your questions and comments, we collect them, and we answer them. Now, another interesting thing is that all of your questions, we're going to theme them slightly, and we're going to put them on this website called haveyoursay.guelph.ca. We're going to put your questions and the answers on that website too. And not just from this evening's sessions, but you can go there and ask more questions and get answers. So all of this questioning and answering will be held on that website as well as other features. You don't have to just limit yourself to the chat box here tonight. You can send emails to clerks@guelph.ca. You can phone them. The phone number's there on your screen, 519-837-5603. And you can go directly online to the website that we mentioned and read the background material, do the survey, put pins on a map, and and get questions and answers. There's also the background material. There's a rather helpful background document that can be read. It's on the Have Your Say site, but it's also at guelph.ca/council, which is kind of a landing page. It's a smaller page. It's not as interactive, but it'll point you to the other one. So for this evening, I'd like to remind people that we're here because everyone has wisdom, and we need everyone's wisdom if we're going to produce the wisest results. That means don't censure yourself. If you got half an idea, half a question, you put it out there and we tease out the answers and we explore it in a very open discussion. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts is another guiding principle for participation, which means we've all got a piece of the puzzle. And we don't have to win or lose on any of this. We'll build something larger together. Another principle is that there's no wrong answers, okay? So don't judge yourself or other people's answers as right or wrong. There's nothing to win or lose. Even what you think might be a dumb question might be the question that everybody else is sitting there waiting to hear the answer to. It's worth repeating that disrespectful or rude comments, they can't be shared in public. So, you know, we can't just cut and paste them onto the website. So keep it polite, please, and we'll have a good time. I want to introduce the panelists this evening now. First up is Bob Williams. He's a retired professor of political science with a lifelong focus on municipal affairs. He's been consulting as a municipal affairs consultant since 2008. He's done a lot of ward boundary reviews, a lot of council composition reviews. He's partnered with Watson and Associates on a number of projects. And he'll be delivering part of the presentation this evening as well. Second up is Dave Siegel. He's also a retired professor of political science. He's been a prolific author and co-author on a lot of topics, most of it relating to municipal governance and administration, and a frequent consultant on these topics as well. So you're in good hands, folks. This is going to the well here for some great ideas. Me, I'm president of ICA Associates. I've been designing and leading participatory group processes for over 25 years. I also happen to have a degree in political science and have partnered with Watson and Associates on some of their larger engagements like this, where we need to really think about what are people saying and dig into it a little bit. And it's been fun this year to try and shift everything online. Lastly, I want to introduce your host this evening, Stephen O'Brien. He's the general manager for the City of Guelph, the city clerk's office. It's also the city clerk. He's got 12 years working in the municipal sector, and half of that's been at the City of Guelph. The other half has been in small rural communities and large urban communities. It's quite diverse, but he brings a wide-ranging interest of digital governance, privacy, access, transparency, and the transformation of government services. So he's kind of an ideal city clerk for you to have. Technically speaking, he's your host this evening. And with that in mind, I want to hand it over to Stephen for our official welcoming.
Great. Thanks, John. Appreciate that. And really excited to be here as well. This is the second time we've touched base with the community on the council composition and ward boundary review project. That project's divided into two sort of broad pieces, this being sort of the second phase. And even within this phase, there's sort of three components that John highlighted earlier. So this is a continuation. Some of the folks that are joining us tonight might remember back to November. And I know that I believe Bob and Dave will sort of talk a little bit about the touch point that we had at council with November, and which certainly helped inform this next phase. So we're really excited to have the opportunity to do this again. To John's point, it's very different. It's very new. But we're getting the hang of it slowly, given the current pandemic. And so this is a really great opportunity to still touch base with the community, hear your thoughts, answer your questions, and we look forward, as John said, to seeing all those questions and comments and doing our best, if not to answer them tonight, to certainly answer them through the haveyoursay.guelph.ca platform. With that, and before we start, it is common for us to provide a territorial acknowledgement. And so as we gather, we are reminded that Guelph is situated on treaty lands that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As a city, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work. And today we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe people whose traditional territory we are meeting. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Stephen. My pleasure to begin this discussion tonight by providing you an overview of the study, and that's the two-part study that Stephen referred to. The consultant team we've heard reference to already. The lead on the project is Watson and Associates economists, who will provide a lot of the technical and empirical work that we need for this study. But we're partnering, of course, with ICA Associates, with John Miller playing the role, and then David Siegel and I are the remaining part of the front side of this team, if you will, the public side. And we were retained by the City of Guelph a year ago, last January, when we thought it was all going to go normally and have lots of meetings in the community. But we're to conduct a comprehensive council composition and ward boundary review. And the first part of that essentially is looking at the size of council and the way the electoral system is structured, with further discussions about the possibility of councillors being working on a full-time basis as opposed to a part-time basis. That took us through to November, when we provided a report to council about our findings at that stage. This tonight then begins the public version of the ward boundary review. So that starts, we started to do a bit of work following that November meeting, but this is the first public component, and we hope to have this project, we plan to have this project completed by June of 2021. So council at its meeting in November gave directions to the consultant team. And what's on this slide are the main components of that direction. First, to conduct a ward boundary review. That is, we will be looking at retaining wards in Guelph, but to do a review of those boundaries and the wards that are part of that, with additional rounds of public engagement. And David will give you a quick overview of that in a moment. This, again, is the first part of the public engagement in this phase of the review. We were also asked to consider scenarios that allow for the election of 8, 10, or 12 councillors. It's a fairly big challenge, but the goal here is to keep open the question of the size of council and to see it through the lens of various ward configurations. And the following bullet that we are asked to consider the number of councillors elected per ward also interacts with that. Are we electing 2 members per ward, 1 member, or perhaps some other number? So that also is part of what we're going to be considering here. And then the third main part of the direction is to provide a recommendation on the employment status of councillors, again, related to the full-time and part-time status. Again, some of that flowing out of the previous decision. So that part will come together in June for a recommendation to council touching on those main points. So let's talk very briefly about a ward boundary review. Big overview question. Guelph has really not had a ward boundary review since about 1990, give or take. So this is, in a sense, a historic moment to actually begin one. And so this is a self-contained part of the bigger project. The ward boundary review process will develop and present a range of alternative ways to ensure an effective and equitable arrangement of the City of Guelph's wards. So there are certain elements of that process that we need to consider, effective and equitable arrangements. We will be coming along with various alternatives, different ways of getting to that. And those alternatives, though, will be based on a set of guiding principles that were approved by council some time ago, and we're going to explain those in a good part of this presentation. What are those guiding principles? Those are the things that we consider in developing alternatives, as well as what we're describing here as neutral third-party professional assessment. That's what David and I will bring to this. The implications of either having 1 or 2 councillors per ward, having full-time or part-time councillors, and also variations in the number of wards. The principles help us. We will draw from other experiences to do that. But as the third bullet points out, this assessment will also include a close examination of input from the community through the study process. So it's a combination of sources and perspectives that will lead to a set of recommendations to council by June.
So, as Bob was saying, there's 3 rounds in this initial part of the boundary review. The first round, where we're in the middle of right now, is the broadest general sort of statement. We're looking for you to give us some ideas about what you think about the existing ward system. Tell us about the strengths and weaknesses, or there boundaries in your ward that you don't think make sense. And so we can choose certain guiding principles. And as Bob said, there are 4 guiding principles that we're going to be talking about later on. And in some ways, some of these principles lead us in different directions. So we'll have to figure out which guiding principles you feel are more important for the City of Guelph, and which ones we should prioritize as we go down that road. Round 3 we'll be dealing with in February and March, and in round 3 we will take this information that you're giving us. I was just asking about wards and so forth, and we will create a number of different alternative possibilities that we will ask you to comment on, because we need to get that sort of feedback to go before council. So we won't be presenting one final arrangement. We want to get your comments on several potential alternatives. And that leads us to round 3, where we'll gather some final input and narrow those several options down to a preferred option, and recommend council what council should do about that preferred option. So let's move to a discussion of what Guelph looks like now in terms of the ward system. Right now, Guelph has a mayor and 12 councillors, and the mayor is elected at large, and the election of mayor is not under consideration. It's not a part of what we're doing here. We're looking at the election of the 12 councillors. And right now, the 12 councillors are elected from 6 wards, meaning there are 2 councillors elected per ward. And you can see the map of the current ward system. That's been in place roughly since 1991. Now, there have been several times when there have been some adjustments of ward boundaries, but what you're looking at there, that map that you're looking at there, the rough outline of that map has been in place for 30 years. That general configuration of wards with some changes and boundaries has been around for 30 years. So that leads us to the next idea. Why, why have we decided to do this? Well, or why did the City of Guelph decide to do it, I should say? The current boundaries have been in place, roughly speaking, for 30 years. In that time, Guelph has grown by 60%. And Guelph has been identified by the province as one of the places to grow, one of the cities that's going to be growing quite rapidly. So Guelph is expected to grow about 18% in the next 10 years. And that growth does not occur evenly. It occurs more in some places than others. And what has happened over the 30 years, not surprisingly, is that those wards, which probably started out fairly evenly balanced in terms of population, are now no longer in balance. Some wards have considerably larger populations than others, and so some adjustment needs to be made. And it's important from our perspective and your perspective that the recommendations that we make, that the new ward boundary structure reflects what you as residents of the city want. So that leads us to the idea that we need these guiding principles to go on with. So I'll turn this back to Bob to introduce the guiding principles.
Thank you, David. The guiding principles are based on experiences in other parts of Ontario and some general perspectives on what a good electoral system looks like. The particular combination, if I can call it that, in Guelph, it come out of a report from the city clerk that initiated this particular project, this big 2-part project. And in that report, a number of specific principles were to be considered, but they were enclosed, were provided in conjunction with a statement that is quoted there. These principles are to be considered subject to the overriding principle of effective representation and consideration of the relevant legislation. Now, we're going to come to that part in a moment. Effective representation is a very important theme. But the 4 key, what we're going to call operational principles, the things that help us understand what is a good system. It helps us understand what is satisfactory about the Guelph wards now and what a new system might look like. The 4 operational principles then are noted there. Representation by population, roughly the goal of population parity. And we're going to speak about each of those in turn in a moment. We're also being asked to consider projected growth patterns. As David indicated, under places to grow, Guelph is a designated growth community, and there will be growth across the city, but probably concentrated in some parts more than others. So we need to look at where that's going to happen. The third principle is another very important one, but much less easy to measure. It's easy to identify perhaps, but not to measure. That is communities of interest. Wards are about representing communities of interest. And in a municipal context, that usually means a neighborhood, a group of streets and living arrangements that have a number of things in common. Communities of interest are one of the key considerations in designing and appraising a ward system. And the last one talks about natural boundaries and geographic features. The boundaries that we use should be, if you will, visible, easy to remember, fairly straightforward, They're not, if you will, lines that we make up to meet some of the other principles. Collectively, these four principles contribute to the achievement of effective representation. So it is an amalgam of these things that are blended together, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about how that might work.
So let's talk about the first principle, and it's an idea that pretty much everybody will be familiar with. It's based on the idea of the one person, one vote principle. The idea that the wards should be of roughly the same size in terms of population. Each ward should have roughly the same number of people, and that guarantees that some people are not disenfranchised, or that some people are don't have the same weight in council decisions as others. We are allowing ourselves at the beginning of this about a 25% variance. And the reason why you have to have some sort of variance in this is because there are three other principles, as Bob said, and he's going to be talking about those in a minute. But we cannot, would be nice to have absolute equality, but that would ignore the other principles, which those other principles have to be weighed in as well. And post-secondary students, which are an important part of the population at Guelph, are included in the population of the city for the purposes of calculating these ward boundaries. So that's the first principle, representation by population.
And the second principle then is projected growth patterns. And our direction here is that ward boundaries should consider and accommodate the city's projected growth and population shifts to maintain what we can call a general equilibrium in representation over a 3-election cycle. So let's take that apart a bit. If the goal of the first one is to get some kind of general equilibrium, this principle is telling us make sure that that is reasonably well achieved over the next 3 elections. In other words, we don't revise the boundaries after every election. We provide a bit of flexibility, partly in the short term, but partly in the longer term. And the goal was to set this out to cover the next 3 scheduled municipal elections in 2022, 2026, and 2030. Now, to reassure people that this is not just a kind of made-up exercise, the consultant team, and in particular Watson and Associates, has significant experience and expertise in demographic analysis and population growth modeling. That is in some ways the bread and butter of that company that we bring to bear on this, the capacity to provide to the ward boundary review detailed population estimates for Guelph and more importantly, its neighborhoods. That is the building block for projected growth. We have that reliable information. We will use that to help us develop potential alternative ward systems. And don't forget too, in passing, we're talking about a number of different ways. There are 6 wards now, but there'll be scenarios for other numbers. So those are the first 2 principles. The third one is communities of interest, and I alluded to that already. And the particular statement we're working from is that ward boundaries should recognize neighborhoods and community groupings, whether they be social, historic, economic, whatever you want to call it, historical groupings that are already here or may come on stream, if you will, over the next 10 years. We recognize those groupings, but we also do not fragment them. We don't draw lines for ward boundaries that divide an identifiable community grouping. Now, some of those are fairly easy to determine, perhaps because of the nature of housing and other kinds of things, but some of it is also more intangible. And again, that's part of why we are going to ask the community to help us understand what are those communities of interest and how should we understand them when we design wards for Guelph.
The fourth principle then is the idea of natural boundaries and geographic features. And what we're talking about here are, when we talk about natural boundaries, we're talking about things like water courses, rivers, maybe major highways, significant ravines, something like this that provide sort of natural divisions within the city. And these are the kinds of things that you look at in terms of producing ward boundaries because, well, for one thing, it's unlikely that communities of interest will cross one of these major geographic features. And the other thing is, it makes it easier for people to understand and remember. You know, you live on the north side of the railway, you're in some ward, and south side, you're in a different ward. Makes it pretty easy for people to remember and to understand what the dividing lines are between particular wards. So our trick is to take into account all four of these principles that we've been talking about. And as you can see now, you almost have to give some greater priority to one or two, and that's what we want you to help us with.
So let me just talk very briefly about this concept of effective representation. As we noted earlier, the direction was to take account of that in relation to the four specific principles we've just looked at. This is also where the legal perspective comes in. The idea of effective representation is part of the way we understand representation in Canada because of a very important judicial decision rendered by the Supreme Court of Canada that's really usually referred to as the Carter decision. And in that decision, the court ruled that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in dealing with equality says that the right to vote is really the right to have effective representation. In other words, the vote itself is about gaining representation. That's the ultimate purpose. But if you're going to be represented, it needs to have some meaning. It has to be applicable. So as we put it in that first bullet, to the extent possible, citizens should have comparable access to their elected representative. Again, you should not be living in a ward that has, let's say, 20,000 people and your friend lives in another ward where there's only 10,000 people. Your access is not comparable. And on the other side of it, each local councillor should speak in governmental deliberations, and I should probably add, and vote on behalf of an equal number of residents. Again, the perspective would be the Carter decision is in effect saying it's about making sure that when that councillor puts up his or her hand to vote, they're representing roughly the same number of people. So that's part of equality, but it's translated into how you are represented. But to get there, the decision also makes clear that boundaries are not just based on population. It's important, population is important, but that's not the only other factor because sometimes, and the factors we've talked about, geography, community history, community interest, minority representation, can somehow be folded into that. To take that previous perspective, there may be a neighborhood that when you take a number of them, put them together, and they're enclosed, let's say, within a certain set of very important roadways, they may, in fact, get to a higher population level. This is basically saying, well, you can't be perfect, but let's keep those places together because they belong together. Those are the kinds of trade-offs we make. The decision of the Supreme Court of Canada is relevant because this principle has been used over and over again and invariably upheld as the basis for a successful electoral system by the Ontario Municipal Board, the body now known as the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. The board has said in many, many cases, effective representation comprising these other things are important. And to that extent, this is why we consider it overriding. Not any one of them is the dominant feature, but it's how those are blended together in the context of your particular community. And as we've just alluded to in this example, sometimes the separate principles may conflict with one another. So the board, in its judgments, again, drawn from Carter, is saying, well, you can avoid, you can deviate from the strict application of a specific principle if it helps you meet one of the others, if it's a way that constructively supports getting to effective representation. So it's not got to be it's not a list where you have to tick off every box. You certainly take them all into account, but you may have to weigh them up a little bit differently. And when there is a conflict between one or the other, the goal is to get to select the combination that brings you effective representation. So our work so far, and we've done a bit of background perspective looking at the current wards, and we've had discussions with members of council as well about these kinds of questions. But we're also taking a very beginning approach to this. The current ward arrangements are important. They've been there a long time. People are familiar with them. They give us some insight into the way these communities of interest were understood in the past. Certain places were grouped together because in 1991 it made sense to put them together to help get to these other goals. But today, that may not be the case. Some neighborhoods probably still will end up in the same ward because they are not divided by a major roadway, or because grouping them together allows us to meet the population principle. But there are other ways that we might have to do this. And in part, this depends on which principles are actually used. They will all be used, but which one is given the highest priority. Very quick example of that. Are we going to draw boundaries that allow us to reach population parity in 2021? Or do we know, because we know there's growth coming, do we draw boundaries that allow us to grow into that? Those may look somewhat different, but that's part of the choice we're going to make, and we'll be asking people to give us some feedback on that. We're also going to have to apply all of this around those other directions about how many councillors are there going to be? Are they going to be elected in 2-member wards or not? So our exercise in the second round will be to pull all those things together, come up with ways of meeting the overall principles, and in particular, the effective representation. I think the main conclusion that can come out of this, of course, is that there's more than one way to divide Guelph for electoral purposes. There was the 1991 way to do it. There'll be a 2021 way to do it, but there may also be successful versions that could take us out to 2031. So where are we in round one? Basically, we want to talk to you about what's important, what we have to consider, and to help you tell us what you believe should be our priorities in trying to evaluate the current wards and look for ways of achieving a better distribution of population to achieve effective representation. The process we're going to use is an online survey, which in the circumstances is a tool that does work. We found it very effective in the last round. So residents are invited to assess the current wards. That's one part of the survey. What do you like? What are the strengths? What are the things you might want to change? And also, which of the principles of effective representation matter the most to you? So we will use all of those perspectives to blend, if you will, together to draw some ward boundaries that will be part of round two. But it's very important for us to know which you believe should be the priorities, not for us to simply say, Guelph, these are the ones you must follow. Those are obviously areas where there is some flexibility involved. I'm going to turn things back over to John Miller at this point.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, David. Cool. Yeah, now it gets down to if that's what you know, how do you share what your wisdom is? And on this page, you have a little picture of this haveyoursay.guelph.ca page that has to do with council-composition. And at the bottom of that page, you'll notice several tabs. And on the right-hand side of that page, you'll also notice that, buried in some of the text as well, there's a background paper. So I would strongly recommend that you read the background paper, share it with other people if you can, and then move on to completing the survey. And that will touch on the questions that Bob mentioned already, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of the current situation and ranking the principles. But there's also a map there. So when you click on the map button, you will be offered the chance to stick a pin on the map. And that pin could be something that you think, ooh, I really like the way this is divided. I want you to keep this boundary line. Or another pin that says, I really don't like where this boundary line is. It doesn't make sense for some reason. But you'll be able to add that reason in there. And this is the kind of wisdom that only people who live in the community, live right in those neighborhoods, really truly understands. And it comes down to simple things like, is this roadway a boundary, or are both sides of that road part of a community that needs to be mapped out? You're the people who know that. So stick a pin on the map and indicate one of those strengths and weaknesses. It's also one of those tabs is for the questions and answers. If there's any question at all that pops into your mind, that's the place to put it if you don't stick it in the chat here tonight. It's also a place where you can, there's a register button where you can leave your name and your email address, and then you can get updates for any changes on this website. And then, you know, when we move to the next phase, you'll automatically know about it. It's also important for you to share this information, this page, with your friends, your neighbors, your family members, because they will have different ideas from you. And we need all of these subtle ideas in order to get a bigger picture of what we can do. So please go to that website. When you take the survey, this is just a little screenshot of the kinds of questions you're going to be asked. So this is strengths that we can build on for the current ward boundaries, and there's the weaknesses that need to be improved. All of this, when we say improved, it means you get more effective representation. And then the big question is, so how would you rank those 4 guiding principles, and why? Why would you prioritize them in the way that you did? Sometimes when you just pick the ranking, it doesn't quite say enough for you, and you need that extra space to say why. And that will help inform the next step. So the next steps, well, we're going to take all the input from this round and all the research, and we're going to put it together into a discussion paper. And the big piece is maps, mapping the preliminary alternatives, so that we can move on to the next round of consultation, which is seeking community input on this wide range of alternatives. And based on that input, we'll be able to finalize a single or maybe a short list of recommendations. And even then, when we're going to have one more cycle back, this round 3, to come back and say, this is what we were going to recommend to council. What do you think? And then it goes to council for their consideration. And bottom line is, it's their choice. They get to decide what to do with the ward boundaries, and they put that in the form of a bylaw. But they got to have it in place now, like in June, in order to be ready for the 2022 municipal election. So we're at the questions stage. If you got any questions, you can write them in the chat box, or right here in WebEx, or on the Facebook, where we're streaming about a few seconds behind. And we'll capture those, and we'll read them and answer them, and we'll throw the floor open to Bob and Dave to answer that you might have. Okay. So we've got one question up here that says, how many councillors are there right now?
Starting point is 12, and that was part of that first round, council composition. Council is 12 members. It's been 12 members for over 30 years. It's been a large council. I came across a document that told me that Guelph has had as many as 11 city councilors since the 1920s. But anyway, it's 12 councilors and a mayor. part of that first round was to look at whether that number, whether it would be advisable to change that number. We wrote something about that idea, but council basically said, in so many words, we want to think about that again. Let's not make a decision first. So part of our direction is to say, all right, are there other ways of doing it? And we will be having a look at some other number. And in particular, we were asked to look at scenarios to elect 8, 10, or 12 councillors. So that is yet to be determined. 12 is the going in position, but there could be some other number. And again, a lot of that will depend, I think, on what the wards might look like and how people would understand the way representation would work in their city. If, for example, there were only 8 or if there were 10 councillors.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how will our feedback be weighed against the opinions of the experts that we heard from tonight? Good question.
All right. Do you want to tackle that, Dave, or do you want me to jump in?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so let me tackle it. That's fine. We look very seriously at the opinions of the local people. We'll do that this time, and we did it last time, because you are the local experts, and a lot about how your community works and the good things about your community and the things about your community you'd like to improve. So we take that into account very seriously. We also have to take into account the principles that are a part of, have become a part of the case law with regard to how we can go about making changes in the ward system. And we also work with Watson economists who really, Guelph is quite fortunate to have Watson involved in this, because Watson is doing other projects for the city where they are looking at projections of future population. And we also will, we've got some expertise on the consultant side, and we will also use our own expertise to weigh all those things together and make a recommendation to council based on those considerations.
Can I just add too that there's not a standard formula. It's not a case of, public input is worth 90% and our perspective is 10, or any other combination. This is something we need to weigh up and filter through, as Dave just suggested, the principles we're asked to look at. Public input that makes a suggestion to things that really don't work very well, don't make them work. We need to keep in mind what is going to work and how but the perspective is to help us understand what people think would work. And that is again, part of this discussion. It's not a formula for sure, but it's important. Okay.
Another good question here about the numbers. Don't the numbers also depend on whether or not we have full-time paid counselors or part-time paid counselors? Full-time might require fewer counselors. Can you just talk about how the number of counselors and whether they're full-time and part-time? Can you just speak to that a little bit, how you do that juggling act?
Do you want to start, Dave?
Yeah, well, that's clearly a part of the calculus that the city council will be taking into account, and it's something that we thought about in the first round. Yeah, I don't know how to. I don't know how much to add beyond that. It's clearly one of the things that we'll be thinking about. I think one of the things that we've talked about is that it's probably not likely to maintain 12 counselors and give all 12 of them full-time compensation. If there's going to be full-time counselors, there probably will be fewer counselors, which it can be compensated for by the fact that they'll be full-time and they'll have more time to give to their duties. So that's the kind of trade-off that council will have to consider when it's making that decision.
What would you
And
add?
the other part of that, if I may, is that what would an 8-ward system look like? What would a 10-ward system look like? What would a 5-ward system look like as a method of election? And if there is something that we can design, just to pick a number, that has only 5 wards in it, then that might be a statement that says we continue to have 2-member wards and 10 of them who are probably part-time. If we can design a system, let's say for 8 wards, that works very well, meets all the principles, that could be the lead up to a change to full-time counselors. So there's a certain logic in there. I don't quite know how those are all going to play out, but that's the way these things will be, to my mind at least, will be packed together, and then we will have to pull them apart to lay out, here are the choices. 6 wards, 2-member, 6-member, 6-ward, 2-member part-time. Those kinds of trade-offs would be there based around the wards that we've got.
So just to be clear, when you say when they will be there, talking about in the second round of consultations, they will be presented for people to comment on.
Yeah. I think, again, we haven't moved very far with that part of the process yet, but I'm just thinking out loud here that let's say we come back to the community and say, here is an 8-ward model. That would mean you could have 8 part-time counselors, or you could have 8 full-time counselors, but that would be part of the, if you will, the framing of a particular option. That a certain option would likely lead to the decision to go full-time, or another one could lead to a different outcome. Again, it's still early days to know how that will play out. But I can see them linking together because that's what council asked us to do.
Yeah. There's a comment here. It's not a question. I favor multiple member wards. Full or part-time is less important to me.
And that's, exactly. So that is the direction that we would have to take. But it still begs the question, how many of those will there be in the 2-member wards? How many wards will there be, rather, electing 2 members?
So this has popped out another question. So how many options do you think will be presented in round 2?
I can't say. It could be quite a large number because of the direction we were given. But we haven't put any pen to paper yet, and that's one of the reasons why that second round is going to have to be a much more robust process, because we're going to have to give people a chance to digest a number of different options that carry within them other implications. So that round will be the most critical to help weed out the direction or the alternatives that appear to people to be less valuable because they lead to full-time, or because they don't lead to full-time, or whatever. But this is, again, it's at the thinking stage. It's not the actual implementation stage.
Yeah, which raises a subsequent question for somebody. It's like, that's a lot. Is there a staging to this, or are all 3 variables coming together at once? The variables of part-time, full-time, and number of wards, and all of these variables. It's a lot to stage. That's all.
Well, and I don't want to monopolize all of it. I'll let Dave get in on it, but I can see them being a kind of package, if you will. This many wards, and don't forget, we're also looking at what they actually look like on the map. Wards that look like this, and X number of them with 1 member or 2 member, that would be a package of some sort. But I don't want to tie our hands too much. I know we have to try and do that, but what form it's going to take, we're going to have to spend the next 2 months working out, a month and a half working out.
Yeah. So one is asking for an opinion. What do you recommend to ensure that as many citizen votes are effective in selecting a representative? Currently, councillors, in quotation marks, win with 25% of the vote.
going to let Dave jump in on that
Well,
one, if I may.
low voter turnout is a problem in municipal systems generally. And I think there's only so much you can do in terms of the structure of wards and so forth to encourage voter turnout. I think there are other things that need to be done. But I think there are some things that can be done in terms of ward structure, and that is that we need to make the wards as clearly defined as possible so that people understand clearly which ward they're in, because I think that's the beginning of some of the confusion, when people don't know which ward they're in and they don't know who they're going to be voting for. So that's one of the reasons why we think so carefully about things like natural boundaries and putting communities of interest together, because if people understand the system, they're more likely to want to participate in it. But I do think that there's a variety of other things that need to be done in order to encourage voter turnout.
Yeah, I may be reading too much between the lines, but I get the sense that maybe that question has also to do with the question of ranked ballots. How do we make sure that citizen votes are effective in selecting the representative, not just winning with 25% of the vote?
Well,
so with that, inferring that much, could you speak to that?
Well, I don't disagree that is perhaps in the back of the mind of the writer of that question, and it's not intended as a cheeky answer, but I would say if that's the goal, then you should be talking to Doug Ford, not to us, because that option was basically taken off the table. The city was going to consider that, but the legislation now said no, you can't do it. So it was a provincial decision to remove that alternative. Dave's other points are valid. We have to work with what's here, and it doesn't include that. So let's help people identify with the ward and see if that improves the turnout. But ranked ballot, sorry, at this point, it's not a part of the equation.
Yeah, and just if I can jump in, John, that was something that came. I guess late in the year in 2020, I want to say early December-ish with Bill 218. So Dr. Williams is quite right that the provincial government had that as an availability for municipalities, and that has since been removed, the ranked ballot voting component. We were, and Dr. Williams is quite right as well, we were quite ready to have an engagement session on that. We were sort of sticking in between the work of these two phases of this project, the council composition and the ward boundary piece, in a bit of a voting systems and voting methods piece. And we had to curtail that back to just talking about voting methods being how people cast their ballots. So yeah, we're sort of bound by the white lines that are set on the pitch for us, so to speak.
And even some of that, of course, is affected by COVID in terms of whether you'll be able to run a traditional election or whether, other techniques are now going to have to be used even more so, and whether they have an impact is also part of the original question too, I think.
I've got a question of clarification here. Is it possible to know the current per ward population? And it might have gone past a little bit too fast or something, but
that information, if I'm not mistaken, was in the paper from the first phase 1 report at some point.
That's right.
Yep. We did have that data in there. So that report or that paper is on the website that John has been referring to, and the current population per ward was part of that. I'm just trying to see if I can find the page number.
And that's something as well that for those that are listening, we can post that information. So, the specific numbers is something we can pull out and respond to that question when we post it on the haveyoursay.guelph.ca page.
Okay. I'm going to stick something in just the link to the background paper in the chat. I'm not sure that anybody else can see that, or if that's just the host, but it's there. Now then, questions. There was another one. There it is. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, there's another question of curiosity here. Is Guelph's structure common across Canada with the whole notion of having 2 councillors per ward? And are there other models that have been very successful for a city of our size? So talk to the 2 councillors per ward model, please.
Well, again, there's a table in the first background document for the first round that compares Guelph to other single-tier municipalities in Ontario in the same population range. And what that indicates is that Guelph is in a minority. Most municipalities of Guelph size have 1 member per ward, but there are other municipalities that Guelph is in a minority, but they're not alone. There are other municipalities that also have 2 members per ward. It's pretty difficult. This is one of those areas that it's up to, it's what the particular municipalities feel comfortable with. Bob a minute ago said something about there's no formula for this, and I think that's the case here as well. There's no formula. The papers that we've done identify the pros and cons of each one of those arrangements, 1 ward or 1 member or multi-members. But it's up to the individual community to figure out what works best in their community.
And just on that point, John, that chart that Dave just referred to is on page 11 of the phase 1 report. The ward population is on page 4. So that information is out there. But yeah, Guelph is an exception in it's a small pool of that size. And our comparison was not across the country. It was simply with comparable municipalities in Ontario, because not that it's terribly relevant here, but the principles that other provinces follow, or the practices, are quite different. I recall doing some work looking at this question, and you discovered that in Quebec, there are virtually no councils fewer than 12 people, no matter what size. But in British Columbia, there's none higher than 10, even for large cities. So it's a matter of local tradition, a local custom. In Ontario, no rules. It's a matter, in this case, I would say it's a matter of history. Guelph has had a council of roughly this size probably since the 1920s. So, you know, that's a factor in there. But it's not that they have to do it, but it's a practice that has been followed.
I would also say too, if I can just jump in, there's 444 municipalities in Ontario. Some are single tier, some are lower tier, some are upper tier. Some have been amalgamated from the past, and that carries with it some of the historical changes that happen with wards and boundaries and such. So, you know, I know that in our sector, we often talk about how, especially when it comes to provincial legislation, as an example, there is no one size fits all for all of those 444. And I would suggest that there's probably no one size fits all model or best model for a single tier city that is 135,000 people like Guelph, because in some cases there isn't an exact comparator in that regard. But even then, and there's not an exact comparator with some of the history or the geography or any number of factors that go into structuring boundaries and such.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, this becomes Guelph's own story.
So another question off to the side here around, can you give an example of what is a strength and what is a weakness of the current ward boundaries? Because, you know, we're being asked to do that. So can you give an example, please, of each?
Okay, I can give it a try if you like. One of the strengths may be that certain of the neighborhoods, let's say in the eastern side of the city, are in a single ward. They may have a lot to do with each other, and that might be a strength. I can think of a couple of weaknesses on the other side, and that is that despite what many people think, the Hanlon Expressway is not a boundary. It probably should be, but it's not. The boundary is actually the Silver Creek Parkway, and that means that the wards on that side of the city are divided in a way that most people would not be aware of. But a strength could also be what particular neighborhoods are grouped together because they have an awful lot in common. Others, a weakness might be that places that are quite different, and that may be a result of growth over time, have become very divergent kinds of places, yet they're in the same ward. But those are, again, those, as David suggested earlier, those are things that people who live there will have to tell us. I don't relate to that, or I do relate to that, or whatever the scenario might be.
Okay.
Maybe I can jump in, John, too. An anecdotal example is some of the boundaries. A weakness might be, and Dr. Siegel mentioned this, the city has seen ward boundaries. They've been very, very minor, very, very iterative in certain ways. The most recent one was a change to the boundary between 5 and 6 in the east end of the city. And because of the new development in that Ward 5-6 area in the east end, previously the boundary literally bisected vacant land, vacant greenfield land. Well, when that was developed, there were now roads that were put in place. And so we made a minor tweak to make sure that houses on one side of the street were captured in one ward and houses in the other were captured in another ward, and that it wasn't an arbitrary line. There may be examples of those things throughout the city, or if they're not there now and there isn't sort of that holistic view that's happening now through this project, those nuances or those little finicky things might become more exacerbated.
Okay. There's a comment here from someone says multiple councillor wards are less important than obtaining effective representatives. Okay, that's good to know. And someone else saying, I've always been confused by multiple council wards. Do I talk to them both? Do I pick a favorite? Do I avoid the one I don't agree with? And I'm not sure if that's a question really or a plaintiff call.
Well, I say go back to look at the phase 1 report, because we do lay out some of those scenarios. Here are some of the advantages. Here are some of the disadvantages that we've heard either through discussion in the surveys or just our own research and other experiences elsewhere, that those are the kinds of things that are typically raised in favor of a system or as a downfall or a weakness of a particular system. Go back to the paper, have another look at that, and that might help look at what those things might mean.
Mm-hmm. And maybe recall this, like there was a question earlier, not in this meeting here. There was another question. Somebody said, I heard a lot about this problem called gerrymandering in another country. I won't say it. How is this different from that?
How is this different from that? David, do you want to tackle one to start with?
Because we read about it in the news, these days.
Yeah, gerrymandering has a particular meaning. It comes from the name of a lizard. And, you look at some ward boundaries in other countries, let's say, and they are very, they're twisted and turns, and you can see that somebody has gone out of their way to include a particular city block and things of that nature. We won't do that sort of thing. I mean, we will put together communities of interest, and they will be based on the ideas of communities of interest. So they won't be drawn for the benefit of any particular group. I think that's one of the reasons why cities like to hire outside consultants to provide this advice to council, so that it goes through the hands of people who have some experience in doing this in a number of different places, and we'll be making that advice. But you can tell, if you see a ward that looks like all twisted around like a lizard, well, that's probably has to do with somebody drawing a ward boundary that takes in a friendly city block someplace.
And if I may join within, I agree with Dave on that. The game that you're talking about under that term is basically drawing boundaries for political advantage. for electoral advantage. And in many cases, it's to do with a political party, but it's not been unknown to draw it because you might have established friendships in certain areas, and you'd like to include that in the ward to help you get reelected. A couple of things that are relevant here. One, as David suggested, this is being designed and drawn outside the hands of council, and even outside the hands of staff. These are not designs that are drawn in-house. And more importantly, they're framed around established, clear-cut principles. So the proposal we come back with, and I can see this happening, we would probably talk about, in this scenario, the population parity principle is well met, not as good on growth maybe, it's great on communities, the lines are good, whatever, and those are the pluses and the weaknesses, so that when council gets to make a decision, it knows what's there and the decision has a rationale. It's not, my friends are over there, so I want this option to help me get reelected. That becomes a highly unlikely outcome because the choice is based on these principles that we're already talking about several months before it's done. The last little part I'll throw in, and it's not a happy scenario, but should it happen that council, in its wisdom, chooses something that appears to be fishy, there is an appeal mechanism. Our goal is to make sure that there is nothing of that sort involved in any of the choices, let alone the final recommendation. So we want to reassure the community that this is a process that is legitimate and sustainable in the event that someone believes it needs to be appealed.
Okay. Another question that's building on an earlier one. Given that we can't do ranked ballots, and sort of within the confines of this project here, what do you recommend that as many citizen votes as possible are effective in selecting representatives? And furthermore, does providing citizens with 2 votes, like having 2 councillors from each ward, does that actually increase the number of citizens that have some kind of representation on council? Can that even be told? I don't know.
David, I don't know if you want to.
No, Bob, you can do this one.
Thank you. Because I'm not sure that there is. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that there is a definitive answer to that question. Partly because of what we talked about earlier, there are not that many cases where people have more than 1 vote. So to be able to say in a two vote system, X or Y might happen that doesn't happen in a 1 member or vice versa, it's very difficult social science to be able to say definitively it's one or the other. We do hear, and again in the paper from phase 1, defenders of a 2-member system will say, I can use my 2 votes to elect a newcomer, or to vote for a newcomer and a veteran, or I can vote for a male and a female, or I can vote for a younger person and an older person. It doesn't guarantee they're going to get elected, but you've got a choice to do that. So that's, again, one of the defenses that many people would use to be able to say that. The problem is we don't use that model for other kinds of offices, but those are often party offices. So we're voting for a party rather than an individual, and we can only pick one. So that's not a very strong answer, I'm afraid, because I just don't think there is something we can pull off a shelf and say, here's the evidence that answers that question. A lot of it is going to depend on the value priorities of the person who's asking that question. What does she or he want to happen at an election in terms of picking a winner or picking someone that they can relate to? And we don't have that answer. They do. That's why we want them to help us with a survey.
Mm-hmm. Another question, I guess this has to do with the principle of managing growth in population. Why does the time horizon for the new model boundaries look out only to 2031 and not beyond that?
Okay, I can take a run at that. I think the perspective is that that's a reasonably safe horizon to use. There can be pretty solid evidence collected over that time period. Once you move beyond that, it's really very difficult to say anything definitive. And the goal here, as I said back in the presentation, is to base this on evidence that is as sound as possible, and it's not just making up numbers. So, given the timelines around growth within the city, growth management strategies, for example, there are forecasts that normally use that kind of time around various empirical elements of let's call it policy making, that sort of thing. That the practice seems to be that 3 elections is a reasonable time to consider. I mean, the other part of it, not to make this don't take this the wrong way. The fact that it's been allowed to stay in place for 30 years in Guelph doesn't mean you're going to have to leave it in place for another 30 years. The point should be that you revisit that on a reasonable basis. Don't forget that boundaries at the federal level are revisited every 10 years. So that's a kind of an analogous timetable to say, okay, let's see what happened. And do we need to catch up instead of waiting indefinitely? You don't do it every election. That's the other side. You don't go change it for the reasons we've talked about. People get confused. I was in that ward, now I'm in this ward, now I'm in the other ward. At least give it a bit of time for people to get used to it, but recognize that it is something that is not going to be a permanent part of the community. It's built around what you know now and what you can reliably forecast for that period of time.
Okay. And I only have one more question on the list so far that we've collected. Is there any cap regarding, for example, after 2 terms of being elected, if you want to run again? So New Energy will get an opportunity to serve the city. The idea of there being a cap on how long you can serve.
Term limit.
Term limit.
Dave, do you want to take that?
No, there are no term limits in Ontario. A number of people would like that sort of thing. A friend of mine who served on council for 40 years says that there are term limits, and the voters decide what the term limits are. But at this point, there are no term limits, and I hate to punt these things, but I guess we do have to punt this one, just like we punted the ranked balloting. This would require provincial legislation in order to effect this sort of thing. An individual municipality doesn't have the scope or the authority to introduce a limitation like that.
Yeah.
And if I can pick up too, Dave, the other part is that if you make that the arrangement, then you're going to create other dynamics that go on in that second term. And I pick up in your point, the people don't get a chance to pass judgment. If you're elected a second time and can't run a third time, then where's the accountability? Where is the responsibility? I'm not saying councillors would necessarily abuse it, but the point is you're performing in the assumption that at some point you need to be accountable for those decisions. If that is removed, the dynamic changes.
Okay. Well, we're at 8:18 Eastern Standard Time, and I'm wondering if, and I don't see any new questions popping up, and I'm wondering if we should move this a little bit more towards a close, or if we want to open the mic for the remaining. There's only 4 people that I can see on the attendee list at the moment. How do you want to proceed? We can just open the mic and ask them if there's anything else that they want to ask, or we could just move to close. We've seemed to have covered everything.
If we've covered things, then we could move to close, I guess.
Yeah, and I think what I would add, John, too, is we know that is, this first round was just about talking about those principles, and that's what the engagement is about. We know that hopefully our second round will be something where we'll get some really good, robust discussion and dialogue amongst the community, and to help inform some of the proposals that will come forward to council. So, if there's no other questions, I think we've served our purpose and hopefully create some good awareness.
So it's really important just to remind people one last time that you go to that website, haveyoursay.guelph.ca/council-composition, and register and tag it and keep track of it, because it will keep changing as people add questions and as we moved into the next phase as well. But that's where you do the survey. That's where we need your input. And that's where you can click on the map to identify things that need to be fixed and things that need to be kept, and to ask further questions. So please use that website. And if that's the end of that, then I want to say thank you very much too.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to everybody
Yes,
for
thank
joining
you.
in. Have a good
fun.
evening. Stay safe.
Good questions.